This is Ross Feingold on the Storm Media's Taiwan Hashtag program, coming to you from Taipei. Today we're going to be talking about Tsai Ing-wen, President of Taiwan's recent overseas trip, which included visits to 4 countries that have diplomatic relations with Taiwan: Haiti, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and St. Lucia, all located in the Caribbean, and the 2 stopovers she made in the United States, both on her way to the Caribbean and her way back. The first stop was in New York City, Manhattan, and she was there for 2 days, 2 nights, and the most notable event was probably a closed-door speech at Columbia University, although the content of the speech was released shortly afterwards, and she spoke about Taiwan's democratic development and pretty much took us through the history of Taiwan's democracy and the importance of supporting the Taiwan democracy in the face of threats from China. So not a surprise from the content perspective. There was a large number of Taiwan students, American scholars, old friends of Taiwan were there. And another event on this itinerary in New York was meetings with business leaders, companies that invest in Taiwan or considering investing in Taiwan. There was a lot of news around some of the attendees of these events. Also, telephone call with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Are these breakthroughs? Well, here's the interesting thing. Whenever there's a discussion in Taiwan about overseas trips by the Taiwan president, the word breakthrough will appear repeatedly, whether in Mandarin language media or in English language media. So almost everything the president does during these visits is called a breakthrough. This pattern started with Chen Shui-bian's visits to the United States when he was president between 2000 and 2008. Ma Ying-jeou, president between 2008 and 2016, very similar. A lot of things that he would do on his stopovers in the U.S. were called breakthroughs. And we've seen this repeatedly with President Tsai, whether it's in our stopovers in Miami, Houston, Los Angeles, Denver, and New York. But as far as making a speech at a prominent university, which she did at Columbia last week when she was in New York, Ma Ying-jeou made a speech at Harvard. It was a closed-door speech as well, but the precedent was set. So for speaking at prominent universities, Ivy League universities, no breakthrough there. Meeting with business leaders. Again, President Ma did the same thing. President Chen Shui-bian also did the same thing. In fact, when President Chen visited Manhattan in 2001, he had a much more high-profile meeting with business leaders. In fact, he met with the then CEO of the New York Stock Exchange, and that was a much more prominent person than the chairman of the NASDAQ exchange, who President Tsai met with during her stopover in New York. The telephone calls with U.S. politicians, again, this is not new. There's no breakthrough there. The president of Taiwan has done that multiple times during stopovers in the United States. President Tsai has had phone calls with U.S. politicians when she was in the United States as well. So no breakthroughs there. Meetings with the scholars, the old friends of Taiwan again, no breakthrough there as well. U.S. scholars of China and Taiwan have met with the visiting Taiwan president on multiple occasions, whether it's at universities or at the hotel where the president is staying. Meetings or gala dinners with Taiwan expatriates in the United States. President Tsai did this during her stops both in New York and in Denver. She's done this before on her stopovers in the U.S. In fact, one of her first stopovers in Miami in 2016. Very large dinner with the overseas Taiwanese community, supporters of President Tsai, supporters of the Democratic Progressive Party who live in the United States. No breakthrough there. U.S. politicians attending this dinner. Again, no breakthrough there as well. So none of these things are bad. They're all very positive. It's very good for Taiwan's diplomacy to go to the foreign countries. It's very good for Taiwan's international status, international media coverage to have these events, whether it's the speech at a university or a gala dinner or the phone calls from prominent U.S. politicians. But we have to keep in mind that none of these events really were a breakthrough. President Tsai, when she was in Denver, did visit 2 federally funded research facilities, one related to renewable energy and one related to atmosphere research. And they have national in the name, so that's going to be called a breakthrough that she went to federal facilities. But we should also remember that President Tsai, in her visit to Houston visited NASA. She visited the Presidential Library of Ronald Reagan when she was in Los Angeles on a previous stopover. So again, visiting federal government or facilities affiliated with the U.S. federal government, not a breakthrough. So it's actually maybe a bit of a risk for the Taiwan media or the Taiwan government to repeatedly emphasize that this is that some of these things are breakthroughs, when in fact they actually are not. And maybe the focus should be instead on the substance of what was achieved during these stopovers in the United States, and that would be what happened in some of these meetings. But if they're closed door, then we're not going to know exactly all the details. Now, it's safe to assume that President Tsai also had some events that have not been announced, meeting with U.S. Either politicians or members of the Trump administration, and this would not be a breakthrough, and it might be kept confidential for good reasons, but there was probably some of that as well, and it might leak out in the coming weeks. But that, you know, from the perspective of what's most important for the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, those meetings and what transpired in meetings with Trump administration officials are probably something that's going to be much more important than speeches at a university or even a gala dinner with Taiwan expatriates. Of course, having the dinner with expatriates is important this year as opposed to the previous visits, because we are in the election season here in Taiwan. And in fact, some of President Tsai's delegation were going to be staying in the United States to do campaigning with the expatriate community, and that's very understandable that they would want to encourage Taiwanese voters who are still eligible to vote, even though they live in the United States, people who maintain their voter registration and their citizenship here in Taiwan, to come back next January and vote. It's obviously a big commitment of time and money to fly from the United States to Taiwan to vote. Listeners or viewers watching our show might be interested to know there is no absentee voting in Taiwan, not as of yet. Despite Taiwan's extraordinary ability with technology and being such a wired society from an internet perspective and the imminent rollout of 5G, there is no absentee balloting. So Taiwan expatriates who are eligible to vote, who live in the United States or other parts of the world, if they want to vote, they're going to have to fly back here. And in what's expected as of now to be a close election, doing that campaigning among the expatriate community in the United States is very important for Taiwan, or for the ruling party, we should say. And there'll be an element of fundraising as well. And of course, that's very important because political campaigns are expensive. So important for the Taiwan community. But again, breakthroughs, I think we have to be very, very careful about calling breakthroughs or calling some of these events during the trip or during these stopovers breakthroughs. As far as visiting the Caribbean countries, it's very important for Taiwan to maintain these relationships. It's very important for Taiwan's international status to have formal diplomatic relations as opposed to the informal diplomatic relations it has with many other countries. And typically these countries will advocate for Taiwan in international organizations such as at the United Nations. So it's very important for Taiwan to maintain support and to provide aid programs and other types of aid that Taiwan and long-running programs that Taiwan has with these countries. And a lot of that was discussed when President Tsai would visit hospitals or other facilities that Taiwan taxpayers have very generously funded in the 4 countries where she visited. Did it have a big impact here domestically in Taiwan, though? Well, one of the big challenges for this trip is time zone differences. So we're talking about daytime events in the Caribbean, which were in the middle of the night here in Taiwan. So by the time people would get up the next day here in Taiwan, maybe they would be watching a news story about something that happened overnight in Taiwan when President Tsai was in one of these 4 countries, whether it's speaking to their parliament or visiting Taiwan-funded aid projects or buildings that Taiwan has contributed funding to build. Again, people didn't really have much opportunity to pay attention or connect because it wasn't happening during the daytime or even the prime time, nighttime hours here in Taiwan. It really was in the middle of the night for the Taiwan audience. So very difficult to capture the attention of the public here in Taiwan. And frankly, people in Taiwan, they know that Taiwan has diplomatic relations with these countries, and they know that it's important. But we're not very familiar with these countries here in Taiwan because of the great distance, because they're small. there's not a lot of trade, not a lot of Taiwan business goes on in these countries. There's a small number of Taiwan business people who have operations there, but not a lot of bilateral trade. These countries don't export many things in general, and they certainly don't export much to Taiwan. Taiwan also doesn't export much to these small countries. They're not only are their economies and populations very small, some of them obviously are not economically well off, such as Haiti. So they don't purchase many things from Taiwan, which Taiwan is known for exporting, such as information technology products, petrochemicals, or even food stuff. So not a very close relationship people to people, even though we'll hear politicians talk a lot about that. But I'd be very surprised if people here in Taiwan feel a very strong connection to these countries, even though they still maintain formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan's government. So what will happen next in the aftermath of this trip for Taiwan's diplomacy? Well, one thing to watch, because President Tsai now has visited the United States, is whether or not the Kuomintang candidate for president, Han Kuo-yu, will try to make a visit to the United States under the title of presidential candidate. Now, Han, as mayor of Kaohsiung, did visit the United States earlier this year. At the time, he was not a declared candidate for the KMT nomination. But based on past practice, he will be looking to visit the United States sometime between now and maybe November or December in advance of the January election. Again, previous KMT or DPP candidates for president have done so. So something to watch will be whether or not he visits and who does he see and how would his visit as far as public events, meeting with Trump administration officials, meeting with U.S. politicians, and meeting with the Taiwan expatriate community differ from the standard that President Tsai has set with her most recent visits to New York and Denver. And on a final note, something that has captured an enormous media attention here in Taiwan at the end of the trip, and has kind of put a bit of a negative period on the end of this trip, is that one of the security officers that was part of President Tsai's delegation has apparently been arrested for attempting to smuggle into Taiwan nearly 200,000 US dollars worth of cigarettes. It appears that the accused made arrangements when the trip was starting, and he purchased the cigarettes here in Taiwan, and they were put in a bonded warehouse, and that when the presidential airplane returned to Taiwan earlier this week, that he would retrieve the cigarettes and utilize the speedy clearance that the delegation would have. Understandably, the presidential delegation was not going to have to go through the red channel at the airport and declare everything that was in their baggage. So the security officer thought he would outsmart the authorities and smuggle in the cigarettes. Unfortunately, he's been caught, and this has resulted in a number of dismissals and forced retirements in the National Security Bureau. And according to media reports here in Taiwan, the president is understandably very angry about what transpired. So again, a bit of a negative on the end of the trip, and no breakthroughs, although a positive trip, but the trip has now ended on this negative note. I'm Ross Feingold, speaking from Taipei, and this has been Taiwan Hashtag.